disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Good morning, everyone. I am excited to be able to preach today on one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. It is a story of the healing of Bartimaeus. The healing of Bartimaeus belongs to a tightly written section in the Gospel of Mark called an inclusio. An inclusio was a standard literary device used for structuring narratives in oral cultures. It allowed the story's teller to mark a beginning and end by bookending both stories with a reintroduction of elements that are common to both. In this way, listeners knew when a section of a story was beginning or drawing to a close. Listeners also knew what was important by what happened in between. We have been studying an inclusio for several weeks now, beginning first with the story of Jesus' healing of a blind man in Mark chapter 8, and ending with today's story of Bartimaeus. In between these stories, we have heard Jesus predict and explain his passion 3 times. Interestingly, this inclusio is the center of Mark's gospel, the whole turning point of the story. And it reveals the true meaning of Jesus' messiahship and what it means to be a disciple who follows him on the path that the author of the Gospel of Mark calls the way. I can never read a healing story from the New Testament without paying close attention to the character being healed. You see, I have a daughter with cerebral palsy. She is vivacious, intelligent, funny, loving, and beautiful, exactly as God made her. My experiences with her play into my reading of this story. My commitment to her as her mother is to seek interpretations of the gospel that are not ableist and help her understand the dignity she holds as one of God's daughters. Every person wants to feel valued, loved, and seen, and for others to also love the people we do along with us. I wonder, did Bartimaeus in today's gospel passage have people like a mother who loved him and worried about his well-being? What was it like for them to watch him struggle to be seen and heard? What was it like for Bartimaeus to live on the periphery of a community that believed that his condition resulted from wrong behavior or alienation from God? How did others' perceptions of him affect his perceptions of himself? What toll did this take on his self-esteem? What was it like to go years without being able to see anyone's face? We can only guess the answers to these questions, but I imagine that he felt tired and alone. His enthusiastic response toward Jesus' arrival speaks to the psychological weight this man had carried throughout his life. We know that Bartimaeus was on the margins of his community. New Testament professor Luis Menendez Antuña tells us, and this is a quote, "He is a liminal character, outside of the city, outside of the path, outside of the light, and outside of the economy. Bartimaeus, like many beneficiaries of Jesus' healing, embodies the effects of social exclusion." We should also keep in mind that such a position most likely kept Bartimaeus from having a household. Although he is the son of, and this is an aside, but Bar means son, so Bartimaeus is son of Timaeus. Men in his situation would not be able to form a family, work to sustain himself or his dependents, or fulfill some obligations that are proper to civic and religious life. End quote. Bartimaeus is extremely poor, and he is very vulnerable. In the gospel passage, Bartimaeus hears that Jesus approaches and calls out to him, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." This statement is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that the phrase "son of David" is used. But it indicates that the writer of the Gospel of Mark desires to show Bartimaeus' understanding of Jesus' royal lineage, as well as a Jewish tradition that has Solomon as healer and magician. He is bold in asking Jesus for what he needs, yes, but most importantly, he believes that Jesus can offer it. And he believes before he is ever healed. This confident trust is one clue about faithful discipleship. It requires belief with all we have that following Jesus will save us. Interestingly, Jesus stands still and has the disciples call Bartimaeus to him. Here we see another model of faithful discipleship in Bartimaeus, as he not only sets aside any concern about the hostility he felt in the crowd, but he throws off his cloak and he springs toward Jesus. Professor Menendez Antuña remarks that Bartimaeus' cloak was likely the only valuable thing he owned. Valuable not because of what it may have cost, but because it provided warmth and bedding and the only social status that he has. He may be compared to the rich young man we read about several weeks ago, where the wealthy young man could not enter the way to follow Jesus. Bartimaeus throws off his cloak and immediately follows him after their encounter. Where the rich young man could not bear to part with the things he owned, Bartimaeus gladly cast off everything he had. Performing the healing in front of the tough crowd is one way Jesus shows the public what it means to be a disciple. Bartimaeus went years, maybe, without being able to look directly into people's eyes. Still, in a very real sense, it was not his physical condition that bound him, but the disability imposed on him through structures created by fellow human beings. After all, it was the structure of his society that could not offer him meaningful work. It was fellow human beings who excluded him from civic and religious life. Now let us pause for a moment and think about why Jesus called Bartimaeus to him. Bartimaeus could not see and likely had difficulty navigating his terrain. So why didn't Jesus go to him? Jesus respected Bartimaeus' autonomy by asking for consent. He did not compel him to come, but offered him the chance to express his faith and put it into action. Jesus created a space for Bartimaeus to demonstrate his beliefs and offer him self-respect. Maybe also, at that moment, it was important for Jesus to draw attention to them both, to give people time to turn toward them, so they could both see Bartimaeus' faithful response and Jesus' acceptance of him, just as he was. Because that is part of the miraculous in this story, that Jesus loves and accepts Bartimaeus, truly sees him before he is physically transformed, and that he does so publicly. His body does not have to change to be acceptable and loved. His liminal status of living on the periphery of community life does not make him unworthy or unloved. Jesus and Bartimaeus both loved and believed in one another's gifts before the act of healing was completed, and both were partners in its completion. Jesus also respects Bartimaeus' autonomy by asking him what he wants before acting. And his healing occurs without touching or magic, but simply after speaking the words, "Go, your faith has made you well." Let us contrast this story with the story that begins this inclusio from Mark chapter 8. You might remember that the first story involved Jesus forming clay out of saliva and placing the clay on the blind man's eyes. Touching is an essential part of that first healing. Jesus does not ask the man about his desires. The man does not proclaim Jesus to be the Messiah, and Jesus is the initiator of the action. However, in today's gospel story, Jesus' word is enough to enact the healing. Bartimaeus is the initiator of what follows, and it is his faith in knowing who Jesus is that makes him bold enough to advocate for himself. Jesus is not the magician here. It is the faithful response of Bartimaeus that makes him well. The word here translated as well can also be read saved. So we see evidence of spiritual healing and not solely a physical one. One other significant difference between the two stories is that the first healing occurs in distinct stages, with the darkness leaving in increments, while Bartimaeus' vision is restored all at once. The contrast between these healing stories shows to the hearers, or the readers, us, that the stories and the material in between will help us understand who Jesus is and the path we are required to follow, and that as we do, we will progressively gain insight. This entire section of Mark seeks to provide us with clear sight that enables us to know who Jesus is and how to join him. This unclouded vision is not physical, but speaks instead to spiritual insight. Remember also that in between these two stories, we have heard Jesus make 3 predictions about his death. These predictions pave the way for future teachings on what faithful discipleship entails. The first teaching occurs with a rebuke to Peter, who does not understand Jesus' teaching on his own mission and seeks to prevent Jesus' death. We learn from Jesus' vehement response that messiahship is about denying oneself, taking up the cross, and following Jesus. The second prediction is met with complete incomprehension. After Jesus' prediction, the disciples shift to focusing on which is the greatest disciple. Jesus' response teaches us that following him is incompatible with status and honor-seeking that place us ahead of other people. And last week we heard about the third and final prediction as Jesus met James and John's enthusiasm with a reminder that greatness involves serving others, even pouring oneself out for others. Here we discover that Jesus' messiahship and the path of true discipleship are intricately connected. A disciple is to follow Jesus in putting oneself last and serving others. The story of Bartimaeus closes this part of the Gospel of Mark by using a disadvantaged and disempowered man to illustrate the faithful embodiment of this path. We know that Jesus' ministry is bound together with the company of people who have been forced to live on the fringes of society, whether they be tax collectors, prostitutes, or lepers, and that he gave special attention and care to such individuals. Whenever and wherever Jesus is present, we can expect barriers to be broken down and division to be eliminated. How does using Bartimaeus as an illustration of faithful discipleship break barriers? How does changing Bartimaeus' physical condition address division? Is this story primarily about spiritual insight or physical transformation? If Bartimaeus' body did not have to change to be loved by Jesus, then why did it happen? The answers to these questions hinge on the difference between curing and healing. Healing occurs when a removal of oppressive systems takes place. Curing is represented by a physiological reconstruction of the human body. In this story, both happen. Jesus seeks to ease the challenges that come with Bartimaeus' physical blindness, but he also seeks to challenge his community in the process. Where Bartimaeus began by sitting unoccupied by the road, the story ends with him walking and following Jesus on the road with purpose. The son of Timaeus has been restored to his rightful place within the covenant community. Jesus' radical acceptance of Bartimaeus was also met with radical acceptance, as Bartimaeus set aside his entire life and what little he has to follow Jesus on the way. Bartimaeus' physical transformation was not performed to bring Bartimaeus' body in line with societal expectations. God does not value some bodies over others. Instead, physical transformation was the best way at that moment to show the great love Jesus had for Bartimaeus and to instruct the people watching, whom Jesus also loved. Bartimaeus' physical transformation teaches us an essential lesson about communal discipleship. Well, an individual can and should be a disciple, and Bartimaeus shows us a faithful path to that kind of discipleship. Our community should also demonstrate discipleship together. Bartimaeus lived at a time where disability was misunderstood and often attributed to sin or personal failing. Jesus chose to effect a physical change in an attempt to bring Bartimaeus fully into the community that was his birthright. Because community always plays a decisive role in who is included and who is excluded. It is the community that develops systems, structures, and rules that either contribute to the well-being of all or contribute only to the well-being of some. In this way, the curing of Bartimaeus can be read as a rebuke to the community that did not have the imagination or perception to create a place where all belong. And because the community could not or would not change, Jesus found a way to bring Bartimaeus into full fellowship with the people around him. However, I ask that we think about how this story may have been different had the community been one that facilitated the growth and flourishing of everyone. As Christians, we must challenge ourselves to actively engage and encourage the discipleship of everyone in our community, accepting whatever unique gifts a person can offer, and without considering anyone to be outside the reach of God's love and favor. Jesus' compassionate act so long ago resulted in healing not solely when a physical transformation occurred, but when a beloved child of God was seen, heard, and restored to a valued social role that reconnected him to others. He experienced redemption from the social stigma imposed on him by a culture that associated sin with disability. He was free to experience dignity, purpose, and a rightful place among his people. Jesus, as healer, holistically looks to a restoration of self-esteem, covenant identity, and social position. But then, shockingly and wonderfully, Bartimaeus considers all of that secondary to following Jesus on the way. This selflessness is the unexpected curve in the story that pushes the hearer or the reader to emphasize the spiritual transformation that has taken place over the physical one. What little Bartimaeus has is discarded as he turns entirely to Jesus as a disciple. The act of healing serves as the focal point for understanding Jesus and Jesus' mission. It is a vehicle for the building of faith, the kind Bartimaeus had. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last, Jesus tells us, and Bartimaeus is the truest representation of this teaching. In the weeks to follow, we will also see that Bartimaeus' story connects us to the next phases in Jesus' ministry as Jesus makes his way toward Jerusalem. But as this inclusio concludes, we are reminded that it can be challenging to see things clearly at first. Discipleship is a process of continuing to cast off the things that inhibit our responsibilities to one another, our communities, and God. Discipleship is moving toward Jesus little by little, and reorienting ourselves when we find ourselves going in the opposite direction. The story of Bartimaeus is a story of hope because with time, effort, and diligence in following the way, we can develop a clear-sighted faith into the person of Jesus, his ministry, and our role in that ministry. I pray that it may be so. Thanks be to God.
Amen.